everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the Austrian Circle. This is the program where we talk about the economics of freedom, here on WHUS Stores 91.7 FM. So thank you very much for tuning into my show this morning. I have a very special guest. His name is Verace, and he is from Libertarian Gaming. He is a writer and an editor and a moderator of Libertarian Gaming, and he is on the show today. We're going to be talking about media, video games, and all sorts of very interesting things. So, Verace, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So why don't we start and maybe have you introduce yourself a little bit, introduce your blog, and introduce kind of what your interest in libertarians and gaming kind of is?
Well, I've been playing games my whole life, and one day we came across some article saying that most gamers tend to be libertarian, and we thought, well, let's throw together this experiment and see where it goes, and it's been going very well.
Great. And what are some of the reasons, or what are some of the kind of statistics, or some of the things that you found in that article that were very persuasive in that way?
Gosh, I'm not sure I can recall any great specifics, but I think a bulk of that overlaps with that most gamers have been the victim, I'd say, of state legislation passed, or at least threatened with it.
In terms of maybe the games that they're playing being banned. I know that this has been in the spotlight quite a lot, where people are coming into the political arena and saying, we have to get, Grand Theft Auto off of the streets. This is teaching kids that, theft and criminality is a good idea. And what are kind of your ideas about that in particular? Like, the games are encouraging poor behavior in people.
Well, I would say that if Grand Theft Auto and games of that nature cause that kind of behavior in people, that much earlier on books would be causing it, TV shows, movies would be causing it, and that's not, with TV shows and movies, there are some groups out there that argue that, but I would say that if it's not one, it's not the other. It's either all or none.
Right. So, like, books are a great influence. Ideas are a great influence on people. I think about violence in society, and I think of what do we kind of worship in society. People go to public school, and they're kind of indoctrinated into the civil religion, and they then come out of there worshiping the state. They worship the military. They worship, going into foreign lands and shooting, innocent people. And, the police, they come in the middle of the night, and they knock down people's doors, and they drag them off to a cage. This is all very, very violent kind of stuff. And so, before we even start to lambast video games, maybe we can look at the structure that's been built up in society to see kind of where violent behavior might be coming from. Spanking is another very good example that I think has been brought to the light by some libertarian thinkers, that, that increases violence as well. So it can't just be video games that are the sole determinant of violence in society.
No, and I think that in general, violent people are going to exist no matter what. And video games, the people who are already prone to being violent, I don't think that video games would make them any more violent or anything like that. If someone feels that this is not wrong, they're going to do it. And video games that's not going to change that.
Yeah, and it's a very big line between fantasy and reality. Games are obviously in fantasy, and so you can kind of act out scenarios that really wouldn't have to do with reality, because you know that you're in this fictional, non-actual reality. And I think that's a very interesting kind of dynamic that happens with games.
Yeah, and if you look at, I'd just say modern sports, like football and things like that, I would say that those things definitely have more violence in them. People get tackled, they get sprained ankles, they get concussions. Video games, no one's getting hurt, and none of that's happening. It's just basically a fictional version of football, of hockey, in a realm that no one gets hurt, usually with fantasy elements or other things.
Mm-hmm. And so we mentioned a little bit earlier about kind of the reasons that gamers are libertarian in nature. And we talked about the state banning things and how they're kind of averse to people banning stuff. Also, do you think it's partially the kind of open environment that games have? They have really a choice of morality. There's been a number of games throughout time. I'm thinking of like DayZ or Knights of the Old Republic, kind of games where you make choices, and those choices have a very real impact. And you can be very good, or you can be also very evil, and you have kind of a lot more options, and you have this expansive universe where you can choose different paths for your character.
Yeah, and I think that not only that with gamers, that I mean things like Minecraft, for example, there's no state they can build. They don't need to get a building permit. They can just have fun and do what they really want to do. Maybe what they want to do in real life, but they can't because the state prevents that.
Right, so they don't come across these kind of roadblocks that they do in reality. In the game, you just go and build, you just, get your stuff together, you go and convince other people to buy stuff from you in exchange, and there's no real kind of bureaucracy that kind of oversees how you bid for resources, how you exchange, how you build things. So that's a very different experience than what we hear about in the real world.
Yeah, unfortunately, in the real world, it's a lot harder than just getting a couple of boards together and building a cabin in the woods like you can in Minecraft.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my friends, I believe, lives in Montana, and they were just trying to, build a new structure in their own backyard, and the government wouldn't allow it. They come in with fines, they come in with threats of imprisonment if you continue to build what you want to build, and again, none of that is apparent at all in video games. So it's a very different experience. So what else? What else are you kind of interested in the gaming environment? Maybe we could talk a little bit about kind of economies that emerge in the video gaming world, in like massively multiplayer online games where you have a lot of bidding and exchanging and trying to get these very important and powerful items, and how the economy kind of emerges around the supply and demand for those items.
Right. Well, in MMOs and in games in general, but MMOs, anytime you get a lot of people together, they're going to want to interact with each other. And MMOs allow trade. And through this trade, the items that might have a very rare drop rate become very more expensive, much more desired. Sometimes, at least, if people like them, it all comes down to subjective value. But those things are a lot more expensive than things that are more common, and this is an inherent factor to all economies. And the economies in games are no exception to economies in real life because you're getting people together. There is a different currency, but it's still a currency, and there are people, and they're willing to use the currency to acquire goods to better themselves, and they'll trade off things they have to try to get other things that they think are better, that what they're trading away someone else could think is better because subjective value. Two parties, they trade with each other. They both think they're getting the better end of the deal, and that's why they trade.
Right, right. And money can be anything, really. It's just a common medium of exchange. It's what allows us to kind of build price ratios between different goods. And so this could really apply to anything. It's not limited to a piece of paper that the government gives to people. It could be gold, it could be silver, it could be rupees, it could be, any other game currency that's out there. Bitcoin is a very exciting technology nowadays. And so there's all different options that we have in games. And again, that we really don't have in the top-down controlled hierarchical society that we live in right now. But so what is kind of your experience with the online economies? Do they work well? Do you find that it resolves a lot of disputes because you can bid for resources, you can exchange, you don't always have to go and grab it from the game environment yourself. So there's not a lot of maybe fighting over those items or things like that. How do you think that plays out in these virtual reality worlds?
Well, I think that first off, one of the biggest issues in video game economies is when the developers try to steer the economy. Uh, I can't speak for modern day RuneScape, for example. I'm sure everyone's played that, but back in the day, I'd say in 2005 or so, when I was playing it a lot, there was zero control, zero interference in the economy, and just players could do whatever they want. I guess there wasn't so much price fixing. Whereas in modern MMOs, a lot of the developers try to actually fix the prices and have things under a certain range, and they'll tweak so many things to try to get it under control, and it ends up just making the economy suffer from like super high inflation or something along those lines. So it definitely shows that a hands-off approach can definitely get those kind of results.
Oh, that's fascinating that we see a prime example of why central planning does not work at all. Markets are just prices and subjective value of all these different participants, all bidding for resources and bidding up things, bidding down things. And when that free flow and movement is allowed to occur, then you just see the prices fluctuating to whatever value people put on them. But then when the central planner gets involved, everything gets all messed up from that. That's very fascinating.
Yeah, and unfortunately, like I said, though, the newer games, I feel, compared to older games, they're trying to control more, and the communities suffer as a result.
Yeah, I've heard that Diablo 3 is an example of this, and their marketplace got all messed up because they allowed too much harvesting of gold, and people were just getting tons and tons and tons of gold. And of course, as the supply of money raised up, as we see in our own economy, we see prices also going up. You know, gold is a very good money because there's only a certain limited amount of it. You can't just magically manifest it out of the air and just have all this money come into being. You have to actually dig it out of the ground. There's a whole process. There's only a certain amount of it on the planet itself. And so we saw a limitation of the supply of money, which kind of kept prices in check. But now that you have this kind of central monopoly money that's printed whenever the government wills it to be, then you see prices rising and rising and rising and all of that stuff. And in the same environment as the Diablo 3 and the massively multiplayer games that we see online too.
You know, one thing I need to say is with a game called Guild Wars 1, in the game, you cannot have, you can basically, they peek out how much gold you can have in the game, and on each character you can only carry 100,000 gold on you at any time. So trades that would be over 100,000 gold, the community came up with something else, and I see this, and this was out before Bitcoin was, but it worked the same way Bitcoin does, I think, that the community found a new currency. They said, well, this currency is not what we need right now because we cannot trade above this value. So they went to ectoplasm, which is a crafting material in the game, you know, to make armor. And it's worth, I think right now it's worth like 11,000 of the in-game gold for one ectoplasm, one ball of ectoplasm. But it allowed players to then trade at much higher values than 100,000 gold for really large trades. And then they eventually went to a different item called an arm brace, which I think is 22 ectos and things like that. So they replaced the traditional currency that the developers put in the game with their own currency. And I think this is kind of like what we can see in real life with Bitcoin right now and other cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, that is very interesting too. People, again, this is why central planning always fails, is that people are just going to make different choices. They say, well, this money isn't working for me. I'm just going to migrate my funds over to this money, and we're going to make a better market out of that. And again, that's why central planning just can never work, because these planners don't actually know what people are going to do. They don't know what they want. It's not just a lack of knowledge. They can't possibly accumulate all of that knowledge and be able to make decisions based on that. So the developer in this way is kind of like taking on the role of the central planner there.
I'd say so.
Yeah. I'm chatting with Verace. He is a moderator on Libertarian Gaming, and we are chatting a little bit about video games and economies and kind of the virtual world versus the real world, and how the state is so involved in the real world and not so much really on the online world, although the developers are kind of putting in the roadblocks that people are interacting with in video games. I was thinking maybe we could talk a little bit about some other media that has some very libertarian concepts to it, because I've been noticing a resurgence of this in mainstream kind of media. We've seen Divergent, we've seen the Hunger Games. There's been a lot of great shows and movies out there that really kind of encapsulate libertarian ideas. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that. So what kind of movies come to mind when I talk about that, and what kind of concepts you thought were very libertarian in nature?
I would say this isn't really anything quite new. I'd say things with libertarian themes have always been pretty popular. I'd say Star Wars has a pretty libertarian theme. I mean, there's a massive centralized body that is just crushing everyone, and everyone's fed up with them, so they team up and they get rid of them.
Yeah, and isn't it funny how the rebels are praised? In the Star Wars universe, the Empire is the bad guy. The Empire is the problem source and the one that's going around and so obviously evil. It's just blowing up whole planets and destroying life and innocence and all of this stuff. And the rebels are the ones that are in the right. They're the ones that are praised. In the early American Revolution, these were the ones that were praised. They seceded from Britain. They left that political entity that they were aligned with and said, well, we don't really want to do that anymore. We're going to go do our own thing over there. They were praised as being, independent and rebellious. And now, sometimes people, look down on the rebels and things like that. So it's interesting how that flip flops in history, how they can be praised in some instances and kind of discarded or disregarded in other instances.
Well, I would say that people will support one thing very, very strongly, and then the second it comes to the news talking about it, they will bail, I guess is the best way to say that. They will bail on their to whatever rhetoric is in front of them.
Right. So you think they're just so heavily influenced by the media and by the ideas that are
Yeah.
being kind of, short circuited into them they're just so wishy washy because of that?
Yes, and backtracking a little bit, sorry, about TV shows, I want to say that Ron Swanson on Parks and Rec is an open libertarian, and a lot of people really like that show and really like that character. And on the show, he is an open libertarian. The actor is not, but the character is.
Yeah, I do watch that show, and I like his character very much. He's constantly complaining about the government and how wasteful it is, and how ineffective it is, and how inefficient it is. And he's right about that. He sees it firsthand, being in the government himself. And how do you feel a little bit about being involved in the government if you're not really in favor of that organization?
Well, I have friends from all sides of this issue, and I have some anarchist friends who feel like you should work even within the system, which is funny to me. I mean, as someone who, I don't know, I think that it can slow it down a little bit. I feel like it won't really bring any real change, and I feel like anyone who actually gets to a real point of power will immediately become corrupt, because I feel strongly that power corrupts.
Yeah, Lord Acton would certainly be in congruence with what you just said there. So, how do we enact some change? So, we've talked a little bit about libertarianism, the non aggression principle. We don't want to initiate any sort of force or violence against any people who do not want that service or program or whatever it is that we're trying to implement under the use of force. What are some alternatives, and how do we get there, I guess?
Well, one thing that I feel very strongly about is education. I feel that education of anything is the most important, teaching people uh, about what policies don't work. Unintended consequences is a big one. Encouraging others to think about unintended consequences, I'd say, is the biggest one for libertarians.
What are some of these unintended consequences, and what kind of comes about as a consequence of those things?
Well, I'd say that, well, for example, the war on drugs is a big one, a very big one. I'd say that something that's an unintended consequence of that, people in general will think that, well, okay, this needs to happen, and then an unintended consequence of the war on drugs, because many people feel that drugs are bad and and should be banned, is that now there are drug cartels in Mexico that are executing thousands and thousands of people. And the only reason they can exist is because there is now a black market that no one else will dare operate in but them. So they essentially have a monopoly over the market, and they're getting funded to absurd levels. So they can do whatever they want and act like warlords.
Right. And what's so interesting about that to me is that it's entirely predictable. We even have a historical context to put this in. You look back at Prohibition, and all of a sudden, all these mafias started popping up. These people who were trying to bring about alcohol, they were shooting each other dead in the streets. And, this was all gone away as soon as they got rid of Prohibition. The mafias dispersed, and they no longer, well, they ran to other banned or legal places, such as prostitution and gambling and now drugs. But it's the same concept. It's the same thing. The government bans something, and then these warlords come in and monopolize and centralize the production and service and distribution of those goods and services. And then you get these warlords. You get these people who are incredibly violent and can do whatever they want as well, because they have all these resources and they have to protect themselves from the state, so they get all these guns. Again, it's just so predictable, though, given what our understanding of libertarianism and the unintended consequences of government policy.
I mean, one thing I actually have an article up today of mine that is titled "Want to Lower America's Violent Crime Rates? Libertarians Know How," and in it I was talking about how basically the main issue with violence are the gangs in America, and they get their funding through prostitution being illegal, through many guns being illegal, and through drugs being illegal, and they sell all of those things, and they do shoot each other, much like Al Capone did back in the days of alcohol prohibition. And if you want, or a way, I guess, to reduce these violent crime rates, as libertarians, feel that getting rid of the gangs would be helpful, because again, they do account for about 48% of violent crime, according to the FBI.
So that would severely limit the impact of violent crime. It would limit the number and all of that. But what about the incentive that the government has to kind of make sure that there is continued violence happening? Because, it's kind of a tail wagging the dog thing, where the government gets more money, it gets more police, it gets the ability to tax, and it gets to pretend to be the savior of everybody if there is this violence going on. So, again, you eliminate the violence, and then the need for kind of the state to protect people goes away. So, there's a big disincentive for them to actually reduce crime in America. What do you think about that?
Well, I think I need to go back to when something that many people, I guess, don't know. It was common knowledge apparently at the time. Most people have forgotten it about FDR. FDR knew Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked, and he just let it happen. So he would have an excuse to go into Europe, and it would be as bad as possible by them just knowing it was going to happen and ignoring it, letting it happen, and then saying, "Oh, well, we were attacked. We need to go into Europe. We need to fight, the Italians. We need to fight the Nazis." I think that's much like a thing with violent crime now. I mean, people are calling for gun control on the basis of violent crime, and now a lot of policymakers have an excuse for that, and they can say, "Well, we're trying to reduce the violent crime rates," and I'm sure that they know that if they unban these things, that it will hurt the gangs. It'll have violent crime, but they have a reason to keep it.
Right. Yeah. It's their paychecks that are in danger, really, if that violent crime goes away. Now, you mentioned World War II and FDR and all of that stuff. I know that you've written a couple articles in more historical context of World War II in particular, given the gaming kind of environment in those in that era. And so what about FDR aligning himself with Stalin, this other, kind of mass murdering dictator guy who kind of gets left out of the moral responsibility category in World War II?
Well, I think that oftentimes the U.S. throughout history, for example, has done a lot of very, very shady things and has allied up with a lot of very shady people. And I don't think they so much care about who they ally up with, as long as it gets them what they want at the end of the day. For example, the South American dictator Pinochet saying that right. Uh, he came into being through a U.S. coup, and he killed a lot of people. Anyone who really disagreed with him, he killed, or he put them in jail or whatever, and the U.S. helped him get into power. So I would say that the U.S. government doesn't really care about the morality or how many people that they're allied up with, how many people they've killed, because they've done it before, and they'll more than likely do it again.
Right. They're interested in getting their interests accomplished, which means more power to the state, more land to the state, more taxes to the state, and more power in general for them. Not necessarily for the general good, which is what they kind of pass off a lot of these things as. So unfortunately, we're just about out of time, Verace. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about your website and how people can get in contact with you and find out a little bit more information about the work that you've been doing over there at Libertarian Gaming.
Well, if you want to find us, you can find us on Facebook under Libertarian Gaming. Our website is libertariangaming.org. If you want to contact me in particular, my email address is verace@libertariangaming.org. Verace Victor LaBoissonniere on Facebook. I think that's it.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I thought we had a great chat about all sorts of stuff in the virtual world, and I hope that all my listeners will come and check back. This is the Austrian Circle, and we are on at Tuesdays at 11 o'clock in the morning here on WHUS Stores 91.7. Have a great week. Take care.
Thanks for having me.